Hey guys, tonight we're diving deep into the strange world of weird medieval rules. I'm talking about the kind of laws that sound completely, utterly ridiculous to us today, but when you put them back into the context of a world grappling with castles, plagues, and some truly chronic bad hygiene, they start to make a surprising amount of sense. So, before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And definitely let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from all around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. When we picture the Middle Ages, our minds often conjure up this single, unchanging, 1,000-year block of time filled with mud, misery, and superstition. We think of it as static, a long, dark pause in human history, but the truth is, it was an era of incredible chaos and constant, gut-wrenching transformation. And the bizarre rules we're going to explore tonight weren't just random acts of cruelty or the quirky traditions of a simple people. They were desperate, often clumsy, attempts to impose some kind of order on a world that felt like it was constantly on the verge of falling apart. They were the legal equivalent of someone trying to build a dam with their bare hands to hold back a flood. These rules were the framework they built to try and make sense of a very scary world, to hold society together when everything was threatening to tear it apart at the seams. And nothing, absolutely nothing, turned their world upside down quite like the Black Death. When the plague swept through Europe in the mid-14th century, it wasn't just a medical catastrophe, it was an event that shattered the very foundations of their society. Think about it on a scale that's almost impossible for us to comprehend. In England alone, it's estimated that the plague wiped out at least a third of the entire population in just 2 short years, between 1348 and 1350. Imagine every third person you know, your friends, your family, the people in your town, just gone. The massive, seemingly endless pool of cheap labor that the entire feudal system was built upon had vanished overnight. For centuries, the structure of society had been as solid and unquestionable as a mountain. There were those who prayed, those who fought, and the vast majority who worked the land, tied to it for generations. That was the order of the world, ordained by God himself. The plague took that mountain and turned it into dust. Suddenly, for the first time in centuries, the surviving peasants and artisans found themselves holding all the cards. They had real power. With so few workers left, the simple laws of supply and demand kicked in with a vengeance. Landlords were desperate. They needed people to plough their fields, to harvest their crops, to tend their sheep. So the survivors could demand higher wages, and they got them. They could demand better working conditions, and they got them. They could even pack up and move to a different village to find a better deal, something that would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier. For the first time in living memory, a common farmer or a simple craftsman might have enough money in his pocket to afford better food, to drink ale instead of water, and, most shockingly of all, to buy nicer clothes. The kinds of things that had always been reserved for the nobility, and you can bet the ruling class was absolutely terrified. This sudden social mobility wasn't seen as progress or a triumph of the common man. To them, it was a terrifying threat to the natural, God-given order of the world. Their entire identity, their entire sense of self-worth, was built on being separate and superior. They were born to rule, and the peasants were born to serve. But what happens when that line starts to blur? If a peasant can afford to wear the same kind of fabric as a knight, how can you even tell who's in charge anymore? How do you maintain authority when the visual cues that have defined society for 1,000 years suddenly stop meaning anything? This deep, existential anxiety is the secret key to understanding so many of the weird rules we're about to explore. These laws weren't just ancient traditions that had been sitting on the books for centuries. Many of them were an active, often frantic, reaction by the powerful to a world that was changing much faster than they could possibly control. They were desperately trying to legislate their own superiority in the face of a new economic reality that was making them feel less and less special with every passing day. They saw the world they knew crumbling, and they reached for the only tool they had to try and piece it back together: the law. They tried to write their power back into existence, to draw a line in the sand and say, "This is who you are, and this is who we are, and no amount of money will ever change that." It was a battle for the soul of their society, fought not on a battlefield, but in the marketplace, on the street, and even in the clothes people wore. So, with that in mind, let's start with the most visual, most personal way they tried to keep everyone in their proper place. So, let's start with the clothes on your back, or more accurately, the legally mandated, scratchy sack that was probably on your back. You roll out of bed, or rather, out of the pile of straw that's pretending to be a bed, and you think to yourself, maybe today I'll try to look like less of a mud-stained disaster. You're tired of the drab, the dull, the dreary. Your eyes wander over to that fancy scrap of fur you found at the market the other day, maybe a piece of fox or beaver. You imagine yourself strutting into the village, maybe trimming your worn-out cloak with it, looking like a medieval influencer, turning a few heads for once. It's a nice little daydream. Well, bad news. Congratulations, you've just broken the law. That's right. In the Middle Ages, fashion wasn't a matter of personal taste or self-expression. It was state policy. Welcome to the world of sumptuary laws, a set of rules so detailed, so obsessive, that they would make a modern-day fashion magazine editor's head spin. The name sounds fancy, but the idea was brutally simple. These laws basically said, wear your class on your sleeve. And they meant that literally. The whole point of these regulations was to make the social hierarchy instantly, unavoidably visible and legally enforceable. You could tell someone's exact rank just by the color of their tunic, the fabric of their cloak, or the trim on their hat. There was no faking it. Your clothing was your ID, your social security number, and your credit score all rolled into one, and you were required by law to display it at all times. It was a system designed to eliminate any and all confusion about who was important and who, well, wasn't. If you're a peasant, you're stuck with wool. Not soft, cozy wool. We're talking coarse, scratchy, dull brown wool, itchy enough to make you seriously question the existence of a benevolent God. Your color palette was legally restricted to the colors of dirt russet, brown, gray. If you were having a really good year, maybe you could afford some coarse linen, which was a slight step up. But that was it. Your wardrobe was a uniform of misery, designed to remind you, and everyone who saw you, of your place at the very bottom of the ladder. Meanwhile, the nobles get to swan around in silks so bright they look like someone dipped them in unicorn blood. They're draped in lush velvets and the finest, softest furs imaginable. And if you, a humble turnip farmer, dare to imitate them, the law will notice. The authorities could slap you with a heavy fine, publicly humiliate you by confiscating your illegally fancy garment, or worse, just throw you in jail to rot. And these laws didn't just ban random colors or fabrics. Oh, they were specific, obsessively specific. Purple was the big one. For centuries, the dye needed to make a true, rich purple was incredibly rare and outrageously expensive, painstakingly extracted from thousands of tiny sea snails. Because of this, it became the ultimate symbol of royalty and imperial power. A proclamation from Queen Elizabeth I in 1562 laid it out in no uncertain terms, stating that, "None shall wear in his apparel any silk of the colour purple, but only the king, queen." There was a tiny exception for dukes and marquises, who were allowed a splash of it in their ceremonial robes. But that was it. If you weren't royalty, you could forget about purple. The same went for cloth of gold. If you weren't the king or queen, you couldn't wear it, period. Fur was another massive deal, a huge, visible sign of status. The English Statute of 1363 made it crystal clear that most furs were for the upper crust only. strictly restricted to those who were at least the rank of a knight or a lady, and the most luxurious furs like ermine, that's the pure white fur from a stoat, decorated with the little black spots from its tail, were completely off limits unless you had a title longer than your family tree. Later laws got even more specific and, frankly, a little weird. In London, they passed regulations that specifically forbade prostitutes from wearing any kind of fur, not even cheap lamb's wool, to keep them visually separate from respectable women. A peasant's wife, if she was lucky enough to own any fur at all, was legally restricted to the lowest grade stuff, like lamb or goat fur, and it couldn't have any fancy trims or patterns. The system was designed to control every single detail, leaving nothing to chance. But these laws weren't just about simple class snobbery, though there was certainly plenty of that. They were also about nationalism and economics. The English government was deeply worried about foreign influence, and that fear extended to foreign fashion. If you started showing up in fancy silks from Italy or wearing the flamboyant styles that were popular in France, it wasn't just a fashion statement, it was seen as a sign of questionable loyalty. In a world of near-constant European conflict, where England was often at war with its neighbours, your clothing could literally make you look like a traitor. It was a visual declaration that your tastes, and perhaps your allegiances, lay elsewhere. Plus, there was a huge economic protectionism angle to all of this. England's entire economy was built on one thing: wool. By limiting the import and use of foreign textiles like silk and velvet, the government was actively trying to protect its most important domestic industry from competition. It was a medieval, by English, campaign enforced by law. One law passed in 1571 went so far as to require all males over the age of 6 to wear an English wool cap on Sundays and holidays. The sole purpose of this rule was to prop up the English wool trade. So, when you wore that illegal silk scarf or that bit of fancy foreign fur, you weren't just dressing above your station. In the eyes of the law, you were a suspected foreign agent actively undermining the national economy. You were a threat on multiple levels, and that's why the fashion police of the Middle Ages took their jobs very, very seriously. And if you think regulating the color of your tunic and the fabric of your cloak is obsessive, you haven't seen anything yet. Let's talk about shoes. Because in the 14th and 15th centuries, the rich weren't just wearing fancier materials on their feet. They were wearing a statement so loud, so ridiculous, it's almost hard for us to believe it was real. They wore shoes called poulaines, or sometimes krakows, and these were the most bizarre, impractical, and frankly, hilarious pieces of footwear you can possibly imagine. We are talking about long, skinny, leather points extending way out from the toes, turning a man's foot into something that looked more like a justing lance than something you could actually walk on. This wasn't just a subtle little point at the end of the shoe. No, this was a full-blown fashion arms race to see who could have the most absurdly long toe points. We're talking points that could extend out for 6 inches, a foot, and in the most extreme cases, as long as 20 inches from the end of the actual toes. Now, you might be thinking, that sounds incredibly stupid. How could anyone walk? Why would anyone want that? And you'd be asking the right questions, because the absolute stupidity and impracticality of the shoes was the entire point. The logic behind this nonsense was simple and brutally elitist. The longer your shoe point, the richer and more important you were, because it was a walking, talking advertisement that you didn't have to do any actual work. You couldn't plow a field in those things. You couldn't build a wall. You couldn't run. You couldn't even climb a set of stairs with any kind of grace. They were a physical manifestation of a life of pure leisure, a way of saying to the world, I am so wealthy and powerful, I can afford to make my own feet completely useless. The trend got so out of hand that it created its own set of comical problems. The points got so long and floppy that they couldn't even support their own weight. So, men had to start stuffing them with moss, or wool, or even horsehair just to give them some kind of shape. and keep them from dragging limply on the ground. And even then, once you got past a certain length, the tips would curl up and get in the way of your knees when you tried to walk. The solution: they would use little chains, sometimes made of silver or gold, to literally tie the tips of their shoes up to their knees, just so they could move around without face planting in the mud. Can you just picture that for a second? A nobleman, draped in velvet and silk, clanking down the street because his shoes are chained to his legs. It is the peak of fashion becoming a self-inflicted parody. Naturally, this trend did not go unnoticed by the authorities, who absolutely hated it. The church, in particular, had a huge problem with the Polaines. Moralists preached against them, calling them vain and sinful. But there was a practical, religious objection, too. It was reportedly very difficult for men to properly kneel and pray when they had giant, stuffed leather spikes attached to their feet. Imagine trying to show your humble devotion to God when your own shoes are physically preventing you from doing so. On top of that, there was a scandalous and widely held belief that the length of a man's shoe point was a hum, proportional to his other attributes, which made the shoes seem lewd and indecent in the eyes of the church. Finally, the trend got so out of control that the king himself had to step in. In 1463, King Edward IV of England had officially had enough of the pointy shoe madness. He passed a law that banned anyone under the state of a lord. So, basically, almost everyone, from wearing shoes with points longer than 2 inches. The law even went after the shoemakers, threatening them with fines and curses from the clergy if they produced these ridiculously long shoes for their lower-class customers. Just take a moment to absorb that. A king, the ruler of an entire nation, took time out of his day of dealing with wars, politics, and plagues to sit down and legislate the maximum legal length of a man's toes. If that doesn't tell you how seriously they took these visual markers of class, I don't know what will. It was a battle for social order, fought one absurdly pointy shoe at a time. So we've talked about the ridiculously long shoes and the color-coded clothes, but that naturally leads to the big question. What actually happened if you decided to break the rules? What happened if your ambition got the better of you and you showed up to the market in a hat that was just a little too fancy, or with shoes that were an inch too pointy? This wasn't like getting a parking ticket. The authorities took this stuff very, very seriously, and the consequences ranged from embarrassing and expensive to, in theory, absolutely terrifying. It was a system designed not just to punish, but to make an example out of you, to remind everyone else to stay in their lane. The most common punishments were a 1-2 punch of a hefty fine and crippling public humiliation. Let's start with the fine. For a peasant or a craftsman, any fine was a big deal. You're living day to day, maybe saving a few coins over the course of a year if you're lucky. A fine could wipe out your entire savings, putting your family on the brink of starvation. Imagine having to go home and explain to your spouse and kids that you're all going to be in debt for the next 6 months because your new shirt was slightly too shiny, or the trim on your cloak was made from a fur that was reserved for people with a higher income. It's so absurd to us, but it was a very real financial threat to them. But the fine was only part of it. The real sting came from the public shaming. The authorities could, and often would, confiscate the offending item right there in the street, in front of everyone you know. Picture it, you've saved up for weeks to buy a new belt with a shiny buckle. You wear it out for the first time, feeling pretty good about yourself, and suddenly an officer of the law stops you, declares your buckle illegal, and takes it from you while your neighbors stand there watching, whispering, and probably enjoying the show. In a small medieval village, where gossip was the main form of entertainment, this was a huge deal. You'd be the talk of the town for weeks, the fool who tried to dress above his station. The shame was a powerful tool to ensure conformity. Now, while fines and confiscation were the everyday reality, the laws on the books allowed for much, much harsher penalties. While it seems to have been rare for fashion crimes alone, in theory, the punishments for repeatedly violating sumptuary laws could be incredibly severe. We're talking about the complete loss of your property, the stripping of any title you might have, and, if your fancy clothes were seen as a symptom of something more sinister, even your life. You have to remember, in their worldview, everything was connected. If you were arrogant enough to defy the king's law about what fabric you could wear, maybe you were arrogant enough to defy his other laws too. If your clothing looked like that of a foreign enemy, maybe it was a sign of treason. If you were challenging the God-given social order with your wardrobe, maybe you were also a heretic, challenging the authority of the church. Your clothes could be used as evidence of a deeper, more dangerous rebellion, and you couldn't just get away with it by being discreet. In a small medieval village or a crowded town, there were no secrets. Your neighbors were always watching, and they would happily rat you out. It wasn't necessarily because they were passionate defenders of the social hierarchy or cared deeply about the law. More often than not, it was just plain old jealousy or boredom, or a way to settle a petty score. Think about it. The best entertainment you might get all year was watching the local authorities publicly shame your smug neighbor for wearing a cloak that looked a little too Dutchy for their station. People would run to the authorities to tattle, creating a powerful system of social surveillance that made everyone the fashion police. So, at the end of the day, you had little choice. You'd slip into your mandatory sackcloth chic, your dull, legally approved wool and your sensible, non-pointy shoes, and you'd shuffle out into the daylight looking exactly as miserable as the law intended you to look. You learned to keep your ambitions in check, to suppress any desire for a splash of colour or a touch of comfort, because in the Middle Ages one of your greatest crimes wasn't rebellion, heresy, or theft. It was daring to look fabulous while standing ankle-deep in mud. Now, let's shift gears a little bit. We've been talking about the rules that controlled how you looked, the very clothes on your back. But the laws of the Middle Ages went so much deeper than that. They governed every aspect of your life, right down to the moment you were allowed to go to sleep. So, picture this, it's evening. The sun has set, the day's back-breaking labour is finally over, and you're sitting by the hearth in your small, cramped hut. This is it. This is the one moment of simple comfort you'll get all day. The flickering flames chasing away the damp chill, the soft crackle of the wood a welcome sound in the quiet dark. You're enjoying the one moment of warmth you'll get all day, maybe sharing a meager meal with your family, when suddenly the night is shattered by a loud, insistent clanging. It's the town bell ringing out across the rooftops. But no, it's not calling you to a late-night church service, and it's certainly not calling you to dinner. It's the medieval version of your landlord banging on the wall, telling you to stop having fun. That sound is an order. It's the curfew bell. The word curfew itself tells you everything you need to know about its original purpose. It actually comes to us from the old French phrase couvre-feu, which literally means cover the fire. And that's exactly what you were legally required to do. At the sound of that bell, usually around 8 or 9 o'clock at night, every single household was expected to smother their hearth, usually by covering the embers with a metal lid or shoveling dirt over them. You had to snuff out your candles, extinguish your lanterns, and plunge your entire life into darkness. This wasn't a friendly suggestion. And it wasn't because the authorities wanted you to be well rested for another day of hard labour. No, the reason for this rule was much more primal, born from a deep and very legitimate terror that haunted every single person living in a medieval town, the terror of fire. You have to understand, your entire town was a tinderbox just waiting for a spark. Think about how these places were built. Houses were crammed together, often sharing walls, built almost entirely out of wood and straw. They had highly flammable thatched roofs made of dried reeds, which were basically like putting a giant pile of kindling on top of your house. And inside every one of these wooden boxes, People were using open flames for everything. They needed fire for heating, fire for cooking, and candles or oil lamps for any kind of light after sundown. All it would take is one sleepy idiot nodding off and leaving their candle burning, one stray ember popping from a hearth onto a straw-covered floor, and the whole place could be transformed into a raging, unstoppable inferno before midnight. Fire could spread from one thatched roof to the next faster than a person could run, and once it started, there was very little anyone could do to stop it. And this wasn't just a theoretical danger, it was a constant, recurring nightmare that these people lived with. Catastrophic fires happened all the time, with horrifying consequences. Let me tell you about what happened in London in the year 112. A massive fire started in Southwark, on the south side of the river. As people panicked, many of them fled onto the famous London Bridge, which at the time was not just a bridge, but a crowded street packed with wooden houses and shops. But as the winds shifted, the flames spread to the bridge itself, and in a truly horrific turn of events, the fire ignited both ends of the bridge, trapping hundreds, if not thousands, of people in the middle. They had nowhere to go. It's estimated that as many as 3,000 people were killed that day, either burned alive on the bridge or drowned as they jumped into the river below in a desperate attempt to escape. This was the kind of thing that haunted the medieval imagination, and it wasn't a one-time event. The city of Lübeck in Germany, which was a major hub of the powerful Hanseatic League, was so traumatized by 3 separate, devastating fires in the 13th century that it triggered a massive public works project to rebuild much of the city using stone and brick, a much more fire-safe material. In 1452, a fire in Amsterdam was so catastrophic that it destroyed 3/4 of the entire city. When you hear about disasters like that, the nightly clang of the curfew bell starts to sound a lot less like a weird, oppressive rule and a lot more like a desperate, life-saving public safety measure that stood between your town and total annihilation. It was a collective agreement to endure a little darkness and cold for the greater good of not being burned alive in your sleep. So the curfew bell was a pretty smart, life-saving idea to keep the whole town from burning down. A necessary evil, you might say. But that wasn't the only reason for it. Not by a long shot. The authorities had another, much more cynical reason for plunging their towns into total darkness every single night. The bell wasn't just about fire safety, it was about control. Darkness was a tool, and they used it to keep the population in line. You have to imagine what a medieval street was like after the sun went down. There were no street lights. None. The darkness was absolute, thick, and suffocating. The streets themselves were narrow, winding alleys, filled with garbage, potholes, and a thick layer of mud, and who knows what else. It was a terrifying place to be. The night was a different world, one that belonged to the shadows. And the government's approach to this was brutally simple. The curfew was their way of saying, we can't actually stop crime, but we can at least make sure all the good, law-abiding people are too scared to leave their houses after dark. It was a blunt but effective strategy. By forcing everyone indoors, the authorities dramatically reduced the number of potential victims out on the streets. It also meant fewer drunks stumbling out of the tavern to start fights and stab each other over a spilled mug of ale, and it meant fewer opportunities for thieves and muggers to lurk in those dark alleys, waiting for someone to pass by. Anyone who was caught outside after the bell was immediately suspect. What legitimate reason could you have for being out in the pitch black? The darkness itself became a kind of police force, keeping people locked in their homes out of sheer fear. Of course, like so many rules in the Middle Ages, this one didn't apply equally to everyone. The wealthy didn't exactly have to follow the same strict regulations. And the reason was simple: they didn't have to. Nobles and rich merchants lived in large stone houses or even castles, which were not nearly as flammable as the common folks' wooden huts. On top of that, they had servants, people whose entire job it was to make sure the fires in the multiple hearths didn't accidentally burn the whole place down. So, while you were being forced to smother your tiny, precious fire, the Lord of the Manor had his roaring all night long, filling his great hall with light and warmth. The curfew, while it was presented as a rule for everyone's safety, ended up being yet another way to reinforce the massive, unbridgeable class divide. It created a tale of two knights lived side by side in the same town. For the rich, the night was a time for feasting, for music, for entertainment and fun. They could enjoy a social life that was completely denied to the common people. But for you, the night was a time of enforced bedtime, a cold and miserable affair. After the fire was out, you were left to stumble around your one-room hut in the pitch dark, trying not to wake the rest of your family. You'd be tripping over the chickens that were likely sleeping inside with you for warmth and safety, and stepping into suspicious puddles on the floor that you really hoped were just water. Any kind of productivity was impossible. Forget reading, not that most people could read anyway. Forget mending your tools or sewing clothes. Unless you enjoyed the high-stakes game of trying not to stab yourself in the hand with a needle by the dim, illegal light of a smuggled candle stub. Your social life, your work life, your entire existence after 8 p.m. was effectively cancelled by law. So there you are. You're lying on your straw mattress, wide awake, shivering under a thin woolen blanket. The world outside is silent and menacing. Inside, it's just you and the unsettling sounds of the night. You can hear the rats gnawing on the wooden beams above your head, and you can hear your neighbors snoring, coughing, and talking right through the paper-thin wooden walls. It's not a peaceful rest. It's a cold, boring, and slightly terrifying wait for the sun to finally rise. And all of this is because someone decided the safest way to run a town was to treat every single resident like a 6-year-old at bedtime. It's not glamorous, and it's certainly not fair, but the curfew bell probably did save countless towns from going up in smoke. Still, it was a constant, nightly reminder that in the Middle Ages, your comfort and your freedom always came second to the brutal necessities of survival. Alright, so we've established that after the curfew bell rang, you were stuck shivering in the dark. Now let's talk about another fundamental part of your life, the food on your table. You wake up hungry. In a world of constant, back-breaking labor, being hungry is just your default state of being. You've been fantasizing about roasted pork all morning, maybe a thick slab of beef if you let your imagination really run wild. You walk into the kitchen. Well, the one-room hut you share with your entire family and probably a few animals, and reality smacks you right in the face. It's Friday, which means no meat. Again, welcome to the world of medieval dietary law, brought to you by the single most powerful institution in Europe, the Church. And this wasn't just a no meat on Fridays thing like some people practice today. That was just the beginning. The medieval church calendar was absolutely packed with fasting days. First, you had every single Friday of the year, off limits. Then you had the entire 40-day period of Lent leading up to Easter. Then you had the season of Advent, the weeks before Christmas. And on top of all that, there were countless feast days dedicated to various saints you've probably never even heard of, all of which came with their own fasting requirements. When you add it all up, it comes to as many as 140 days a year. That's nearly 40% of the entire calendar, when eating the meat you craved was not just unhealthy, it was considered a sin. So, forget about that fantasy of sizzling bacon. For nearly half the year, your reality was salted herring. Again. Now, the spiritual message behind all this was clear enough: discipline and sacrifice. It was about taming the appetites of the body to focus on the purity of the soul. But there was a very practical, almost genius reason for this rule, too, one that had less to do with heaven and more to do with sheer survival on Earth. You have to remember, medieval society was constantly living just one bad harvest away from a catastrophic famine. In that world, livestock was incredibly, unbelievably precious. A cow wasn't just a walking stake. That cow pulled the plough that tilled the fields. It gave the milk that you turned into butter and cheese to survive the winter. and its hide eventually became the leather for your shoes and belts. If everyone just slaughtered their animals at the first pangs of hunger, the entire agricultural system would completely collapse. These church-mandated fasting days, whether it was intentional or not, worked as a brilliant form of resource management. They forced the entire population to rely on other food sources, like fish and vegetables, which stretched the all-important meat supply and helped keep the agricultural economy from imploding on itself. Still, knowing there's a good reason for it doesn't make it any more fun. Just imagine trudging home after spending 12 hours doing back-breaking labor in the fields, your muscles aching, your stomach growling, only to find a plate with a piece of dried, salted fish glaring at you like it knows how disappointed you are. And, surprise, surprise, this rule was yet another thing that highlighted the massive gap between the rich and the poor. The rich, naturally, had it slightly better. On fasting days, they weren't suffering through a bony, muddy-tasting carp. Their chefs would prepare them fresh sturgeon, or eels, or even beaver, which the church had conveniently classified as a type of fish since it spent so much time in the water. They even had elaborate fake meat dishes, culinary marvels made from things like ground almonds and spices, skillfully molded to look and feel just like a piece of meat. You, meanwhile, were stuck gnawing on something that had been packed in salt 3 months ago and tasted like it. Of course, people are people, and they cheated. A black market for food thrived. Smugglers sold contraband meat on fasting days, and you can be sure that plenty of peasants quietly roasted a chicken behind closed doors, hoping the neighbors wouldn't smell it. But if you got caught, the punishments were severe. You could face heavy fines that would ruin you, or you could be subjected to public shaming, a favorite medieval punishment. Or you might be forced to perform penance, which often meant standing in church for hours on end, while the entire village stared at you like you had single-handedly doomed all of their souls to eternal damnation. But here's where a simple dietary rule gets really interesting and has consequences that no one could have ever predicted. This simple rule, don't eat meat, ended up shaping the entire economy of Northern Europe and created one of the most powerful trading empires in the world. And it all came down to that one sad little fish on your plate. Now, this is where a simple dietary rule, something that seems so personal and pious, gets really, really interesting. This is where it stops being about your soul and starts being about politics, power, and a staggering amount of money. That massive, continent-wide, legally enforced demand for fish on fasting days created what was probably the single biggest business opportunity of the entire Middle Ages. And the group that saw this opportunity, seized it, and built an empire on it, became one of the most powerful and influential economic forces in the world, the Hanseatic League. If you've never heard of them, think of the Hanseatic League, or the Hansa, as a kind of medieval supercorporation. It was a powerful and incredibly well-organized confederation of merchant guilds and their market towns that completely dominated trade all along the coasts of Northern Europe. And they built their vast, sprawling empire on the back of one humble, silvery, and very smelly fish, the salted herring from the Baltic Sea. The League used its immense collective wealth and its powerful navy to establish a near-total monopoly on the entire herring trade. They didn't just sell the fish, they controlled every single step of the process with ruthless efficiency. They controlled the prime fishing grounds in the Baltic. They controlled the trade in salt from the great salt mines in Germany, which was the essential preservative that made the whole business possible. They controlled the production process itself, where literal armies of women would work on the shores, cleaning, salting, and expertly packing the fish into standardized barrels. And finally, they controlled the vast shipping network of stout, reliable ships called cogs that distributed those barrels of herring to every corner of Europe. They had the entire supply chain locked down. The sheer scale of this operation is almost impossible to wrap your head around. At the absolute peak of the trade, the city of Lübeck in Germany, which was the unofficial queen of the Hanseatic League, was receiving over 65,000 barrels of herring a year. And that was just one city. The total annual trade across the entire league is estimated to have been as high as 300,000 barrels of fish. This colossal trade, an economic engine that employed tens of thousands of people and generated fortunes, existed almost entirely because the church had told ordinary people they couldn't eat meat on certain days. The profits from this herring monopoly became the economic backbone of the Hanseatic League. That money funded the growth of their great cities, it paid for their armies and navies, and it gave the League so much political and military power that they could challenge kings and win. The humble herring didn't just feed the people, it literally shaped the balance of power in northern Europe. And then, almost as suddenly as it rose, the herring empire fell. In the 16th century, a new and powerful force swept across northern Europe, the Protestant Reformation. This was a massive religious upheaval that challenged the authority of the Catholic Church. And one of the many changes it brought was the complete abolition of mandatory fasting days in the new Protestant countries. Suddenly, for the first time in centuries, millions of people in places like Germany, England, and Scandinavia were free to eat bacon on Fridays. And they did. The demand for salted herring didn't just decline, it completely collapsed. It fell off a cliff. With that one theological shift, a major pillar of the Hanseatic League's immense power simply crumbled into dust. It's one of the most incredible examples in all of history of how a set of rules, created for purely religious and spiritual reasons, can have massive, unforeseen, and world-changing economic and political consequences. So, the next time you think about medieval life, remember this story. And while you're sitting there in your one-room hut, chewing on your 47th plate of miserable, salty fish, just remember that you're not suffering for nothing. You're not just eating a sad dinner. You are a tiny, unwilling cog in a gigantic machine. You are propping up medieval Europe's version of food security, and you are fueling a global economic powerhouse that is making kings tremble. Still, I'm willing to bet that no rule in history, no matter how important, has ever actually made fish taste like bacon. And that, my friends, is the real tragedy. So, we've established that for a huge chunk of the year, the church had your menu planned out for you, and it was mostly fish. But what about the food that was right there, practically begging to be eaten? The food that was hopping merrily through the woods just a few feet from your village? Well, that was governed by a whole different set of rules. And these rules didn't come from a priest in a church, they came from the king and his nobles, and they were enforced with cold, hard, brutal force. So, picture the scene. You're starving, and I don't mean I could really go for a snack. Hungry. I mean deep, gnawing, desperate hunger. Your family is starving. The cabbage stew you've been eating all week tastes like sadness in liquid form. Then, through the trees, you spotted a plump rabbit, twitching its nose, practically begging to be put in a pot and roasted over a fire. It's the answer to your prayers. Perfect, right? Wrong. Dead wrong. That rabbit belongs to your lord. In fact, everything in these woods belongs to your lord. The trees, the deer, the wild boar, and yes, even that smug little rabbit that looks so delicious. Welcome to the brutal reality of medieval hunting laws, or as they were more formally known, the forest law. And the first thing you need to understand is that in medieval England, the word forest was a legal term, not a geographical one. It didn't necessarily mean a place with a lot of trees. A royal forest could be heathland, farmland, moors, or even entire villages. What the term actually meant was that this was an area of land that had been set aside for the king's personal hunting and was governed by its own separate, incredibly harsh set of rules. This was a concept that was brought to England by William the Conqueror after his invasion in 1066. He basically just pointed at huge chunks of his new country and afforested them, which is a fancy way of saying he declared them to be his private game reserves. At its absolute peak, the royal forest covered nearly a third of all the land in England. A third of the country was the king's personal playground. These areas had their own courts, their own judges, and their own special officers called foresters, all with one simple job: to protect the venison and the vert. Venison referred to the animals of the chase, things like red deer, fallow deer, roe deer, and wild boar. And vert referred to the greenery, the trees and undergrowth that provided food and cover for those animals. Essentially, the entire ecosystem was legally protected for the king's pleasure, and the needs of the people who actually lived there came in a very, very distant second. For the common people who had the misfortune of living inside the boundaries of a royal forest, the laws were an absolute, unending nightmare. Let's break down just how oppressive this was. Let's say you're a farmer. You are legally not allowed to put up a fence to protect your own crops from being eaten by the king's deer. You just had to stand there and watch as these protected animals wandered out of the woods and devoured the food that was supposed to feed your family through the winter. And you couldn't do a thing about it. Need wood to fix your hut or keep your fire going. Too bad. You couldn't gather firewood or cut down any timber for building without special permission, which was rarely given. Do you want a dog for protection or companionship? You could. But if it was a large dog, one that might be capable of chasing a deer, you had to have it ambled. This was a charming and brutal process that involved removing 3 claws from the dog's front paws, or even severing the tendons, to make sure it couldn't run fast enough to hunt. And of course, the biggest rule of all: you absolutely, under any circumstances, were not allowed to hunt the very animals that were making your life miserable. Now, the nobles didn't just protect their game out of pure greed, though there was plenty of that. For them, hunting rights were a raw and visible display of power. Being able to ride into the forest with a pack of hounds, a team of servants, and your fancy crossbows wasn't just a fun weekend hobby. It was a live-action flex of your status and your authority over the land and its people. Meanwhile, you, the peasant, were supposed to stand by and maybe clap politely as your betters slaughtered the very animals you weren't even allowed to touch. These laws were also a powerful and deeply hated symbol of the Norman conquest itself. When William the Conqueror imposed the forest law, he was sweeping away the traditional rights of the Anglo-Saxon people who had lived on and used that land for centuries. He was imposing a foreign, absolute form of royal power, and every time a peasant was punished for taking a rabbit, it was a brutal reminder that they were living under a foreign occupation. So, as you walk home, empty-handed, your stomach growling, dreaming of a roast rabbit you will never, ever taste, you're reminded that your survival isn't about skill or need. It's about remembering your place. And if you forgot, the consequences were designed to be unforgettable. So, we've established the rules. The forest is the king's playground, and that plump little rabbit is his property, not yours. But let's be realistic. You're starving. Your children are crying from hunger. Hunger is a powerful, persuasive force, and at a certain point, it starts to scream a lot louder than your fear of the law. So, what happens if you take the risk? What happens if you slip into the woods at dusk, set a simple snare, and catch that rabbit? What is the actual price of poaching? Well, if you were caught, you were in for a world of pain, because poaching wasn't treated like petty theft. In the eyes of the early Norman kings, it was a crime taken about as seriously as murder. The punishments were not designed to be fair. They were designed to be terrifying, to make an example out of you, and to terrorize the local population into total, absolute submission. The legal codes from the reigns of the first Norman kings, like Henry I and Henry VII, known as the Forest Assizes, make for some truly grim reading. They lay out a system of justice that was less about law and more about raw, brutal enforcement of the king's will. If you were caught having killed a deer or a wild boar, the most prized animals of the hunt, the prescribed punishment was blinding and castration. Just take a moment to let that sink in. This wasn't a fine. It wasn't a few months in a dungeon. It was a permanent, horrific mutilation, designed to mark you for the rest of your life as someone who had dared to defy the king's authority. It was a punishment designed to take away your manhood and your sight, to leave you a broken and dependent shell of a person, a walking warning to everyone else who might even think about poaching. And the cruelty of the system was breathtaking in its scope. It wasn't just about punishing a successful poacher. The law punished the attempt, the very thought of defiance. If you were merely caught shooting at a deer and you missed, you could have your hands chopped off. Think about that. You didn't even cost the king a single animal, but for the crime of trying, for the audacity of raising a weapon in the king's sacred forest, you could lose your hands, and with them, your ability to ever work or provide for your family again. These laws were a raw and deeply hated symbol of the Norman conquest itself. They were a way for William the Conqueror and his successors to impose a foreign, absolute form of royal power over the land, sweeping away the traditional rights and customs of the people who had lived there for centuries. Every peasant who was mutilated for trying to feed his family was a fresh reminder of their subjugation. Now, a system this brutal and this unpopular can only last for so long before something breaks. The forest laws were so extreme and so universally hated that they became a major political issue. It wasn't just the starving peasants who despised them. Local barons and landowners also deeply resented the king's absolute authority over a third of the country. And eventually, this simmering resentment boiled over. When the English barons finally cornered the infamous King John at Runnymede in 1215 and forced him to sign the Magna Carta, they didn't just include clauses about taxes and the rights of free men. They specifically included clauses to limit the power of the forest law. And they didn't stop there. Just 2 years later, in 1217, they forced the new boy king, Henry III, to sign a companion document to the Magna Carta, something called the Charter of the Forest. This document was a huge victory for the common people, and its most important clause explicitly banned death, blinding, and mutilation as punishments for any forest crimes. From then on, the penalty for poaching was usually a massive fine, a fine you almost certainly couldn't pay, which would likely land you in debtor's prison, but at least you got to keep your eyes and your hands. It was a monumental shift, a small but significant step away from justice as terror and towards something a little more recognizable to us today. Of course, when we talk about poaching in medieval England, one name inevitably comes to mind: Robin Hood. The modern image we have of him, from countless movies and books, is of a noble hero who lives in Sherwood Forest and fights the very injustice of these forest laws, stealing from the rich to give to the poor by poaching the king's deer. But here's the fascinating twist: that's not really what the original medieval stories were about. The earliest ballads about Robin Hood, from the 14th and 15th centuries, almost never mention the forest laws at all. Yes, he and his men live in the woods, and they eat a lot of venison, but their main enemy isn't the king's gamekeeper. It's the corrupt, greedy sheriff of Nottingham and wealthy, powerful church officials like the Abbot of St. Mary's. The idea of Robin Hood as a principled social rebel fighting specifically against the hunting laws is a much later invention, something that became really popular in the 18th and 19th centuries when people were romanticizing the past. Still, despite the reforms and the risks, peasants still poached. Hunger is a powerful motivator, and for many, the dream of a real meal was worth the terrifying gamble. So, you've been caught. Maybe you took that rabbit, maybe you wore a hat that was a little too fancy, or maybe your neighbor just has a grudge against you and accused you of stealing a loaf of bread. What happens next? You're off to court. But I want you to erase every image you have in your head of a modern courtroom. There are no lawyers in powdered wigs making passionate arguments. There's no jury of your peers carefully weighing the evidence. There's no DNA, no fingerprints, no CSI team dusting for clues. In fact, in many cases, the evidence doesn't matter at all. The truth doesn't even really matter, because in the early Middle Ages, truth wasn't decided by mortals. It was decided by God. and God apparently moonlighted as a particularly brutal game show host. Welcome to the trial by ordeal. Justice with the subtlety of a sledgehammer. The whole system was based on a concept called a judicium Dei, which is Latin for a judgment of God. The logic was simple, if completely terrifying. If you were innocent of the crime you were accused of, then God, being all-knowing, all-powerful, and fundamentally just, would intervene. He would perform a small, timely miracle to protect you from harm, proving your innocence to everyone. But if you were guilty, he would simply stand aside and let nature, and a red-hot iron bar, take its course, revealing your guilt through your suffering. On the surface, it almost sounds fair, in a terrifying, Old Testament kind of way. That is, until you realize that medieval Europe was absolutely full of innocent people who just had really, really bad luck. The system was less about justice and more about a high-stakes, divinely sanctioned gamble with your life. There were a few popular methods, each more horrifying than the last. Let's start with a classic, the ordeal by fire. Imagine you're the accused. You're standing in a church, the whole village watching. The priest says a few prayers, and then the judge hands you a bar of iron that has been heated in a fire until it's glowing a menacing red. The judge says, "Walk 3 paces." You have no choice. You take the bar, and for 3 agonizing steps, your skin sizzles like breakfast bacon. The smell of your own burning flesh fills the air. After you drop it, they immediately bandage your hand, wrapping it up tight and sealing it, and then you wait. For 3 long days you wait, the searing pain in your hand a constant reminder of what's at stake. At the end of the 3rd day, you're brought back to the church, and the priest unwraps the bandage. If the wound is healing cleanly, if it looks good, then congratulations! God has performed a miracle on your behalf. You are declared innocent. But if the wound is festering, infected, and oozing, which, in a world completely without soap, antiseptics, or antibiotics, it absolutely, almost certainly will be, then you're guilty. Enjoy your punishment. Or maybe you get the ordeal by water, which was even more of a catch-22. For this one, they would tie you up, often with your right thumb tied to your left big toe, to make it impossible for you to swim. Then, a priest would bless a nearby body of water, a pond or a river, making it holy, and then they just toss you in. Here's the twisted logic: if you sank, you were declared innocent. The pure, holy water had accepted you into its embrace. Of course, you were now at the bottom of the river and probably drowning, so you had to hope that they pulled you out in time. But what if you floated? Well, then you were guilty. The blessed water, being pure and holy, would physically reject a liar, pushing your sinful body back up to the surface. It's exactly the kind of bizarre, nonsensical logic you come up with when no one's invented science yet, and it put the accused in a truly impossible position. And then there was the method preferred by the nobles, the one that appealed to their warrior instincts, the ordeal by combat. If someone accused you of a serious crime, instead of dealing with lawyers or judges, you could both just grab swords and go at it. God, apparently, would choose the winner, granting victory to the person who was telling the truth. This sounds dramatic and almost noble, a way to let divine justice sort things out on the battlefield. That is, until you realize that the other guy is 6'5", has been training with a sword since he could walk, and is wearing $1,000 worth of custom-fit armor, and you've spent your entire life hoeing potatoes. Guess who God is going to favor today? For centuries, this was the gold standard of justice, a system where your innocence wasn't proven by honesty or character, but by whether or not you could survive these medieval party tricks with fire and water. So next time you find yourself complaining about jury duty, just remember, at least no one is asking you to grab a hot iron bar and hope that divine intervention doubles as a really good skin cream. So, for centuries, this was it. This terrifying, unpredictable, and frankly insane system of divine roulette was the gold standard of justice. It seems so alien to us, so completely irrational. But over time, even the institution that gave the ordeal all of its power the church started to get seriously uncomfortable with the whole thing. Theologians and deep thinkers within the church began to argue amongst themselves. Was this really how God's justice was supposed to work? The main argument that started to gain ground was that it was fundamentally wrong, even arrogant, to test God. Think about it. An ordeal was essentially a demand, a command issued to the creator of the universe. It was forcing his hand, telling him that he needed to show up at a specific time and place to perform a miracle on a schedule, just to settle a dispute over a stolen pig. It began to seem less like an act of faith and more like an act of supreme arrogance. On top of that, the results were obviously painfully unreliable. The system was clearly not working as intended. The final nail in the coffin for the trial by ordeal came in a single, momentous year 1215. Now, you might remember that year because it's when a group of angry English barons forced King John to sign the Magna Carta, a document that would change the course of Western law. But at the exact same time, another hugely important event was happening in Rome. The powerful Pope Innocent III convened a massive church council, bringing together bishops and clergy from all over Christendom. It was called the Fourth Lateran Council, and it was a major event where the church laid down the law on all sorts of issues. And buried among the many decrees that were issued was one that would completely revolutionize the justice system. The council officially forbade any and all priests from participating in any trial by ordeal. This was a death blow, a total knockout punch to the entire system. The ordeal's legitimacy, its entire power, came from the belief that it was a sacred, religious event. It was the priest who said the prayers, the priest who blessed the water or the iron to make it holy, and most importantly, it was the priest who officially interpreted the divine result. Without a priest there to give it that holy seal of approval, the trial by ordeal lost all of its legal and spiritual authority. It was no longer a judicium Dei, a judgment of God. It was just a bunch of guys throwing someone into a pond or making them hold a hot piece of metal. It was just torture. And so, with that one decree from Rome, the practice that had dominated European justice for centuries quickly died out all across the continent. But this created a huge new problem, especially for the very practical and process-driven English legal system. They had just lost their primary method for deciding guilt or innocence in serious criminal cases. It was a legal vacuum. What were they supposed to do now? They needed a new system, and they needed it fast. The solution they came up with was an act of genius improvisation that would fundamentally change the world. England already had a system that used something that looked a little bit like a jury. For years, they had used something called a jury of presentment, what we might recognize today as a grand jury. This was a group of 12 local men, usually knights or property owners, whose job it was to investigate crimes and decide if there was enough evidence or suspicion to send a suspect to an ordeal in the first place. They didn't decide guilt or innocence, they just decided if a trial was warranted. So, with the ordeal suddenly gone, the English courts essentially just pivoted. They turned to that same group of 12 men and asked them a brand new, revolutionary question. They were no longer asking, should this person be tried by the ordeal? Instead, they asked, based on what you know, is this person guilty or not guilty? And just like that, in that moment of legal desperation and improvisation, the trial by jury as we know it was born. Think about how absolutely incredible that is. A decision made by a group of theologians in Rome for purely religious reasons about not testing God had the direct and completely unintentional consequence of creating one of the absolute cornerstones of modern democracy and secular law, a move that was designed to protect the sanctity of God's judgment, ironically ended up creating a system that placed judgment firmly, for the first time, into the hands of a defendant's ordinary, mortal peers. As we've journeyed through this world of bizarre rules, a clear picture emerges. The medieval world wasn't just weird for the sake of being weird. These rules, from the clothes on your back to the fire in your hearth, From the food on your plate to the way your guilt was decided were the essential, if often clumsy and brutal, tools that a society used to function in an age of immense uncertainty. They were all created for what, at the time, seemed like very good reasons. The sumptuary laws were a desperate attempt to preserve a social hierarchy that was being threatened by the Black Death. The curfew was a blunt but effective way to prevent catastrophic fires and reduce crime. The dietary laws, imposed for spiritual reasons, accidentally created a massive economic trading bloc. The brutal forest laws were a raw expression of royal power and conquest. And the failure of the trial by ordeal forced the invention of a more rational system of justice, the trial by jury. While we no longer live by these specific laws, the underlying tensions they tried to manage, the relationship between social status and wealth, the balance between personal freedom and public safety, the management of resources, and the unending quest for justice are still very much with us today. The medieval world wasn't just a strange and distant past, it was a laboratory for ideas about how to build a society, and in many ways we are still living with the consequences of its experiments.